Good friends, I wish I could be with you tonight as you honor the men who made the ultimate sacrifice so that we could enjoy the fruits of freedom. I have wonderful memories of growing up in Ridgeville. The Second World War was fascinating for a young boy, and it wasn't until we received notification of Edward Keisler's death and I witnessed the sadness of the Winters family when their son was missing. They were customers on my paper route. And the death of the two sons of the Muhar family, neighbors on Avon Belden Road, that the horror of war entered into my life. Edward Keisler, a North Ridgeville hero. I remember well my first meeting with Edward Keisler. He was moving into my bedroom. I believe it was 1936, but it could have been a year later. The principal at Ridgeville High School, Miss Elizabeth Wilcox, who had been a teacher with my mother, had called to say that a fine young man at the school needed a home. He had been told by his widowed stepmother that he would have to leave school and find a job to help support the family. Or if he wanted to stay in school, he would have to find a family to live with. It was the middle of the Great Depression, and the widow was having a difficult time supporting her family of 7 children. Miss Wilcox told my mother he was an excellent student, a fine young man, and an outstanding athlete. She thought Eddie could live with us and earn his keep by working in my father's small business. I remember that Eddie was tall. I was only 4 and everyone was tall. And he had dark hair. I was a towhead. He was very quiet and so was I. Fortunately, I had a large bedroom and we lived together very compatibly. Later I realized that he also was very handsome, but at 4 that didn't register. My father was concerned that when summer came, Eddie, along with the other young men in Ridgeville, would not have an outlet for their energies, so he started a softball team, the Ridgeville Democrats. Eddie played center field and I got to be bat boy. The team was very successful, and before the next summer my father and other members of the Ridgeville Civics League began to work towards having a lighted ball field for use of his team and other young people from Ridgeville. Eventually, Eddie was dubbed Ridgeville's Joe DiMaggio by Joe Holtrick Sr., Ridgeville's #1 baseball fan. When Pearl Harbor was attacked in 1941, Eddie immediately tried to join the Air Force. But in 1941 and 1942, only college graduates were accepted in the Air Force, a practice that would soon change as the pool of college graduates declined. Having been unable to join the Air Force, he volunteered and was accepted in the Seabees. His skills as a welder and with power tools were welcomed by them. However, before he was called up by the Seabees, he was drafted into the Army, and they put him in the Air Force. The military works in strange ways. Eddie went to Biloxi, Mississippi, where he trained as a flight engineer and top-turned gunner on B-17s. He was assigned to the 8th Air Force and was part of the very early groups of planes going to England to inaugurate daytime bombing to complement the night bombing of the British Air Command. Eddie wasn't able to write and tell us about his missions, but he could send an article from the English papers about raids that he had been on. My mother kept a scrapbook with the articles. In the early days of the war over Europe, Air Force men who had 25 missions could return to the States and become instructors for the men in training. We carefully kept track of the number of raids he participated in. The loss numbers were very high in those early raids, and sometimes as high as 50% of the planes did not return. Fighters could only escort bombers while they were over part of France. Once they got over Germany, the escort had to return to England to avoid running out of fuel. They rejoined the bombers as they returned from their missions. Once the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, realized that they simply waited until the fighters left before they attacked. Later, long-range fighters with extra fuel tanks extended the range of the fighters, and the loss rate dropped dramatically. One of the unique happenings was that Eddie's pilot was from Illyria, and he was a graduate of the Juilliard School of Music in New York City. Henry Nagorka lived on Abbey Road, but more about him later. I'd like to tell you about 3 of the raids that their plane, the Isa Angel, participated in. The plane was named Isa, I-Z-A, after the pilot's fiancée Isabella, and the angel being added because she was an angel of mercy, a nurse. The first raid I'd like to tell you about was one of the most famous air raids of World War II, the bombing raid against Schweinfurt and Regensburg. These two cities contained the factories that produced the ball bearings that were so necessary to keep Hitler's highly mechanized war machine operating. This was one of the first maximum effort raids over Germany. The Isa Angel was in the formation that bombed Regensburg. Their target was so far into southern Germany that they did not have sufficient fuel to return to England. So the planes would have to fly to bases in Africa, refuel, and then return to England. The Isa Angel was badly damaged, and one of the crew had his hand shot off in that raid. Pilot Nagorka asked for permission to leave the formation and fly at a lower altitude where he could make better time and could get the wounded crew member to medical help. He had lost a great deal of blood. They were able to get the wounded crew member to the medical assistance, and he did survive. The plane was repaired in Africa, and when the plane was ready to fly back to England, the pilot asked to take a trial flight to check out the repairs. He asked to fly from Libya to Morocco, where coincidentally his fiancée was serving as a nurse. When the plane returned to England, the crew chief went over the plane carefully and found an unexploded shell in the gas tank. If that shell had exploded, the plane would have exploded with the loss of all of the crew. Often, conscripted workers from occupied countries would deliberately not put explosive powder into shells. The second raid I want to talk about saw the Isa Angel get a lot of coverage in U.S. newspapers, and Mother received many clippings from people around the country. On a raid to the interior of France, the Isa Angel was badly damaged and eventually dropped behind the formation. As they moved over French territory, 8 fighter planes showed up. At first, the crew thought they were friendly escort planes, but soon the planes attacked the crippled bomber. Over many miles, the dogfight fight continued. The crew of the Angel shot down 4 of the enemy aircrafts. One of the kills was credited to Eddie. The final Messerschmitt 109, whom they nicknamed Ferdinand, continued to attack all the way to the English Channel. When he apparently ran out of ammunition, he flew past and tipped his wings as to say, "You win this time." As the Angel limped back to England, the crew sang "Coming In on a Wing and a Prayer." At the time, it was the first bomber to be credited with shooting down 4 enemy planes on one mission. Their plane had to be scrapped. It was so badly damaged. It was the 3rd plane that had to be destroyed or sent to be completely overhauled. The final mission I want to tell you about is the 24th for the crew of the Isa Angel. Because the crew's experience, pilot Nagorka and the crew were designated as the lead bomber of the formation that was to attack a Baltic Sea harbor that held a large cruiser in dock. The lead bomber had the responsibility of navigating the formation to the target and dropping flares over the target. On the way to the target, problems arose in the crew of the Isa Angel. The bombs had not been properly racked, and they fell down on the bomb bay door. They were forced to jettison their bombs. Under normal circumstances, they would have returned to their base after letting their bombs drop into the Baltic Sea, and they would have been credited with their 24th mission. As a lead plane in the formation, they had to continue to the target and drop the target flares. Their plane was badly damaged, and eventually they had to ditch over water. All members of the crew parachuted into the sea. 6 members of the crew were rescued and became prisoners of war. 3 bodies of the crew, including Eddie Keisler's, were recovered and buried in military cemeteries. The one crew member, the co-pilot, was never found. Henry Nagorka said that while he was floating down, German pilots were firing at men in their parachutes and in the water. As an 11-year-old, I followed Eddie's military career very closely and was deeply saddened when we received the news of his death. After 20 missions, we began to hope that perhaps the crew of the Isa Angel would make 25 missions and return safe to the United States. Eddie had become a hero to me long before he went into service. He was an outstanding athlete, but he was a close friend who did many little things to please me and help me to mature. I would add this postscript about Henry Nagorka. Henry Nagorka was interned at the famous Stalag 17 in Bavaria, that prison camp made famous by Hogan's Heroes, and he and 2 other officers managed to escape. They were successful in getting to neutral territory because Hank spoke fluent Polish. When questioned, he was able to convince people that the 3 of them were from Poland and were conscript workers. Prisoners of war who escaped were given the choice of staying in the service in the United States or being discharged from the military. Henry decided to stay in and was assigned to a base in Florida. On one of his first days, he was assigned to kitchen duty, at which point he changed his mind, was discharged, and returned to Illyria. We had an opportunity to meet with him and talk about his experiences and those of his crew. He told us that after parachuting in the sea, he fought against the cold and the rough sea. He was fairly close to giving up when a German boat came and fished him out of the water. He had many good things to tell us about Eddie, including how very valuable Eddie was to the crew in his position as flight engineer. He told us that Eddie was alive when he parachuted from the plane and was surprised that he wasn't rescued. Eddie Keisler was and has long been my personal hero. Thank you.